Now, I don't usually watch witch shows. Surprise, surprise. But I did watch the first season of American Horror Story and then kind of lost interest after the second season. But I did recall that at the end of the first season, there was the birth of a child who was going to bring the end times. So I thought, well, they're probably going to tie the entire series into some kind of Antichrist narrative. And what we've seen in the most recent season that just premiered, Apocalypse, is that's actually the case. So even though I skipped seasons 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I had a suspicion that all of these seasons would be tied together, and that really that the events in some way all connect in terms of ushering in or bringing in the last days. So I want to take a look at this overall view here and look at some of the symbolism and what we saw in this opening episode of this new season, and see if we can decode what's really going on here and how the symbolism is being used. First thing that you want to take notice of is the black demonic sort of figure here and the birth of what is obviously going to be the Antichrist or something along those lines. But notice the date that it premiered, 9/12. And I think that's interesting because, in my book, if you read Esoteric Hollywood 1, which you can get signed copies at Jay's Analysis in the shop, you'll know that I discuss the connection of 9/11 and ritual symbolism, the two towers, Jachin and Boaz, the collapse of the two towers. And this would actually make sense because the events, even though I'm not positive if the entire seasons of American Horror Story have referenced 9/11, the 9/12, the following, that is the day or the times after 9/11, it would make sense that would be the new aeon or the new age. And that's what we're going to see, is that the series is obviously taking us into the period of the new aeon, the satanic aeon that they believe they're going to bring. And I'm going to tell you exactly why they believe this and how the TV show is actually showing you the occultic and esoteric worldview. Of course, around the turn of the millennium, the 90s, if you recall, there was a whole bunch of terrible end times movies, Antichrist movies, especially, for example, the Last Days with Arnold fighting Antichrist and Satan with bazookas. There was also a host of others like Bless the Child, The Calling, the classic, of course. If you remember Lost Souls with Winona Ryder, who has a thing for the Antichrist. Of course, Ninth Gate will be in my sequel, Esoteric Hollywood 2, with a lengthy analysis of the film and its symbolism. But you can go back to the 70s, and there was Damien and The Omen and all that. So most of these movies are ridiculous, and they don't show anything relevant to the way that the scriptures actually present the end times or the notion of Antichrist or the spirit of Antichrist. But there is one aspect to the present American Horror Story which is relevant, which is that they do believe that by doing these films and by doing the manipulation of symbolism in terms of the mass consciousness, in terms of the collective unconscious, the collective psyche, that they actually can help invoke and bring these things. And that's going to be relevant to the thesis of this video towards the end. Now we know that in the beginning episode of season 8, the new season Apocalypse, we see the character Michael Langdon appear on the scene at the end, and he's the elite of the elite, the top of the totem pole, the apex predator, we're supposed to believe at least, or some sort of vampiric version of that, who's there to filter out the wheat from the chaff amongst the elite who survived the apocalypse. But in Murder House, you'll recall that he is actually given the name Michael Langdon at the end of season 1. So we have a clear connection to this original season and the Antichrist coming. Now in episode 1 of season 8, we have the Trumpocalypse. It's the end of the world, probably from Trump tweeting insults to Kim Jong-un and his thugs and his crew. The ICBMs have been triggered, and it's the end. And we are shown a bunch of trendies in LA, And the billionaires, of course, have a way out. Now, this is interesting because this brings to mind ideas like breakaway civilization and the notion of an ark, which I've covered in many movies and many of my analyses. If you read my book, you know that this came up in some of the Bond movies, the Bond films. But don't forget that this was also a prevalent theme in the goofy 2012 with John Cusack. And the only reason I bring up 2012 is because it did have the notion of the billionaires and the elite basically purchasing their slots on a giant ark when the end came. And of course here, 2012, you notice the poster showed you the destruction and the end of Christianity. It also had, the collapse of the Vatican and all this, which was really just symbolic for the end of the old world and the coming of the new. And that's a prevalent theme here in the new season of American Horror Story Apocalypse, is that the end of the old world has come and now there's a new aeon, a new order. And it's very interesting what that aeon, that order, is based around. The idea of the breakaway civilization is the same principle as what's taught in Scripture. And the elite, of course, tell us how laughable the Bible is, but isn't it interesting that they do seem to have the notion of a breakaway civilization, belief in the principle of the ark, the idea that should there be some sort of disaster or catastrophe or something like this, the elite have slots prepared to save themselves in terms of underground bases or something like this, which I do think there is a degree to which this is real. There are continuity of government programs, and certainly in the case of any kind of real emergency, most of the elite would have a way to consider themselves free from danger or safe in any of these kind of situations. So there is some truth to this, and it's not accidental that it's throughout so many films. Think about Sky Captain: The World of Tomorrow. That was one of the themes in that movie. So the Bible is laughed at amongst the masses, but actually there's a lot of interesting facts and truths that you actually could find in the Bible. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about how there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Antichrist. I'm going to give you my analysis. If you're interested in a fuller treatment specifically on the topic of Hollywood, the breakaway civilization, and predictive programming in film, you can watch my lecture, Hollywood Occult Predictive Programming, at my YouTube channel. It's had about 20,000 views and 10 or 20, 30,000 on another channel, so that's worth checking out. I put a lot of time and research into that, and it's based on a lot of the same material in my book. So definitely go to jaysanalysis.com and get yourself a copy of Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which has about, 150 5-star reviews now. It's been out for about a year and a half. Definitely something you should check out. As we move through the seasons of the show, we notice a progression of greater and greater evils, more and more insanity. So in many ways, it does kind of line up with the 20th century. And what we find out about the cult is that it is based around eugenics. It's based around a radical selection process that the government has secretly based on taking people's DNA. Now, these programs about storing people's DNA and their lineage, their history, that's all real. That really does exist. The government has done that for decades. It's a known public program. That's why there's all these genetics labs and these genetic history libraries that exist, like that the Mormons do. That's all part of the government research. Now, there's all these hidden government projects that deal with the storing away of people's DNA. That's partly why babies' blood is taken when they're born, and that's to chronicle everyone. It's all part of mapping the genome and so forth. And in the film that comes up, it's actually referenced that people that gave their genetics, their DNA to Ancestry.com were part of the selection process for who would make it into the elite club in the breakaway civilization, who would make it to the underground facility to avoid the apocalypse. As we move through the seasons of the show, we notice a progression of greater and greater evils, more and more insanity. So in many ways, it does kind of line up with the 20th century. And what we find out about the cult is that it is based around eugenics. It's based around a radical selection process that the government has secretly based on taking people's DNA. Now, these programs about storing people's DNA and their lineage, their history, that's all real. That really does exist. The government has done that for decades. It's a known public program. That's why there's all these genetics labs and these genetic history libraries. That now there's all these hidden government projects that deal with the storing away of people's DNA. That's partly why babies' blood is taken when they're born, and that's to chronicle everyone. It's all part of mapping the genome and so forth. And in the film that comes up, it's actually referenced that people that gave their genetics, their DNA to Ancestry.com were part of the selection process for who would make it into the elite club in the breakaway civilization, who would make it to the underground facility to avoid the apocalypse. Here, as you can see here, this is not even a conspiracy theory. It's mainstream news. I've known about this for at least 15 years. And it was all the way up until 2010 that it was in mainstream news. So this has been public for at least 8 years, but this program has gone on at least 40 or 50 years, but nobody knows this, or at least it's been forgotten. And you're wondering, do you make the cut? Do you make the cut, sir? Did you make it onto Yale's rowing team, sir? If not, sir, you don't make the cut, sir. Please shuffle over into the welfare line, sir, to be exterminated, to turn yourself into Soylent Green, sir. You don't make the cut, sir. Sorry, your bum is dirty. You've got a dirty bum, you don't make the cut. Now, as they explain to the new inductees into the cooperative, as it's called, this apocalypse cult, they explain that they're the new elite. It's based on a rigid system, sort of like Brave New World of alphas and betas and workers and so forth. And they're told that it's the new aeon. They're told that it's a new era of humanity based around survival of the fittest, which is actually the satanic doctrine. So they believe that tech and social media destroyed the world. There's some truth to that, apparently. And the natural order is going to be restored, by which they mean, of course, the purple people eaters. They're actually purple. There is hints of cannibalism here. They actually do apparently eat people. And the elite who are chosen here are ironically under the most strict rules, far more strict than before this new aeon. So it's interesting because Crowley and many of these occultists, these Satanists, they talked about bringing in the new aeon. And isn't it interesting that we're seeing in mainstream news now the rise of cannibalism and how blood transfusions from the young are good, and it's there's nothing wrong with eating human meat. It's all normal, it's all natural, because it's just part of the natural process, right? Men are just beasts, because if you look at the natural world, that's what you see out in nature. That's why we don't argue for natural rights here, because it's all based on Darwinism, predicated on social Darwinism, and humans are not animals. They can be reduced to that state through degradation, but actually we're not just beasts. We have a higher self, a soul, a nous, a consciousness, and that's the link that we have to God. Of course, we can cut that off and become like beasts, and that's what we get with the beast system that is intentionally being set up to actually trap everyone, to destroy them. So it's almost like an engineered social Darwinism, survival of the fittest system that intentionally, through dysgenics, it really does actually depopulate. That's its chief purpose, to ensure that the smartest, the wisest make it through and survive. So in this sense, I want to talk about how the show is correct in presenting the spirit of Antichrist. And you'll notice that they talk about the nukes going off and all this as a giant cleansing ritual. And this has come up a lot in films. It came up in Watchmen. If you remember the Alan Moore film version of Watchmen, that was the plot, was that the nukes brought world peace. This is how we're eventually going to achieve all this, is through giant warfare, mass human sacrifice. And for the elite, that's of course always been a way to cull the population. So that's interesting, because that is the plot of this new season. As an added bonus, the film stars Kathy Bates, looking like your local women's studies professor, who probably actually is in an apocalypse cult, and she plays the role very well. But the reason I bring this image up is that you'll see that it's not just an end times scenario where you have a group of people trying to survive. It's also clearly a cult. So we're going to get this Babylon working type imagery, which interestingly I think harkens to Twin Peaks. It's actually Jennifer Lynch, David Lynch's daughter, who's going to be directing one of the episodes in this season. If you saw my analyses of the latest season of Twin Peaks, you'll know that I think there's a connection between the Babylon working and the possibility that Laura Palmer's mom was possessed as a result of this opening of this gateway, that the bomb tests at Trinity site were actually a ritual working, as we see in books like Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, that opened a gateway for the demonic, and that such destruction at such a powerful level, the destruction of atoms, signified a kind of ritual working of the sacrificing of nature itself, right? The splitting of the atom in a kind of sacrificial way. That was also in my first book, Esoteric Hollywood. And as I said, this leads to the new Aeon in Twin Peaks and the opening of the gateway for Jowday to possess Laura Palmer's mom to give birth to the entity that will bring the end times. That's exactly what we see going on in the narrative of American Horror Story. Not exactly sure what's going on here, but perhaps they were in one scene eating people's fingers, so I guess they're chomping down on the digits of Marilyn Manson, and I'm not sure what's going on with this, but they did want to eat a bird at one point, but it's radioactive, so no birds for dinner. Either that or this is Powder doing his greatest impression of Ozzy Osbourne. But regardless, the season is clearly full of revelation of the method.
This is serious stuff, Coop. Real end times Blue Rose stuff, if you catch my drift. Coop?
You'll notice here in this promo image that they even use the inverted pentagram, which shows the inversion of good. And actually the whole show is about the inversion of good. The reason I bring all this up is that the ultimate theory here is, again, that the end times can be ritually invoked. You have with a lot of these Gnostic and occult groups the mistaken belief that the book of Revelation, John's Apocalypse, is a magical text and that it was actually written as a secret coded way to yourself bring about the end times, should you be able to decode it perfectly and have enough incest, right? According to Jack Parsons and some of the people that believe this view. If you had enough incest, you could probably bring the end times. And although that's very gross, that's what some of these deluded people actually believe. So there's a lot of people, I would suspect, in Hollywood who are tending to believe this as well, that they can bring about this end if they do enough of these occult ritual workings in film. And real briefly, though, I want to point out that that's not what the book of Apocalypse is talking about. The Apocalypse is talking about the first century, and it's talking about the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But it's also talking about, yes, the end times and all that, but it's not a magical text. It's not a ritual working text where you can trigger this through some, technological nuclear bomb type thing. That's not at all what it's talking about. And there's no reason to believe that either. That's just what somebody cooked up as a way to dupe people. In reality, the spirit of Antichrist is not some mere end times phenomenon. It will certainly become more prominent in the end times, although I'm not convinced that we are in the end times. And that's a different topic for another video. But if we read 1 John 4, 2-3, by this you know the Spirit of God. Everyone who confesses that Christ has come in the flesh is of God, and every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God. And this is the spirit of Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and is now already in the world. So the spirit of Antichrist has existed in every age, and especially in our present age. So every person that does not confess the orthodox doctrine of Christ incarnate is of the spirit of Antichrist. If you like this analysis, be sure to click subscribe and give me a thumbs up down below. Also, be sure to check out Jay's analysis and definitely click the bell down below to be sure you get the updates.